Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. So today we are going to study about the inguinal canal development. Now this topic is actually the part of embryology, but it is included in the gross anatomy curriculum of the UHS. So that's why we are studying it with the gross anatomy topic of inguinal canal. Now being a medical student, before starting any topic or any concept or any process, we must first know about the reason why something is happening or why the process is happening. So let's first understand why this happens. So now you have to imagine the embryo at 6 weeks. Neither testes nor ovaries are in their adult positions. Both develop high on the posterior abdominal wall near the kidneys during the embryological life. We already know that. So what like that initially the kidneys, then testes and ovaries, and then we have the posterior abdominal wall. Actually this is the position. But later what happens in male? The testes must travel all the way to the scrotum, and in case of females, ovary only moves into the pelvis. Now the question is, how does the testes know where to go? Because how do the testes come to know of all of this? So actually the nature has created two important structures. One is the processus vaginalis and second is the gubernaculum. Okay. Now everything in this chapter revolves around these two structures. The chapter of the abdominal wall actually. Now let's talk about the processus vaginalis. So according to our book, it says a peritoneal diverticulum called the processus vaginalis forms before the descent. Okay. Now let's understand this every word in detail. Peritoneum. Peritoneum is the membrane that is lining the abdominal cavity. Think of it like the wallpaper that is actually covering the abdominal wall, abdominal cavity and its viscera. Okay. Now the diverticulum. What is a diverticulum? Actually the diverticulum means an outpouching, like blowing a bubble from a balloon. It's just like this. So that means the peritoneal bulge, that is the peritoneal diverticulum. Now this bulge is called the processus vaginalis. So definition will be processus vaginalis is a finger-like diverticulum, or you can say outpouching of the peritoneum. Now why does it forms? So because the testes needs a tunnel to travel safely into the scrotum. Now you can think of it like digging a tunnel before laying railway tracks. So you are like laying the tunnel first, then the train later passes through it. So the same goes for the processus vaginalis first, and then the testes later pass through it. Now where does it actually begins? So it actually forms before the descent of testes and ovaries from their site of origin, high on the posterior abdominal wall. Now let's understand this. So you can imagine that the posterior abdominal wall, and then we have testes, and that the testes pass through the processus vaginalis begins, and the processus vaginalis, then below the testes, processus vaginalis begins growing downward. So it grows towards the future scrotum from the testes. Now it passes through the abdominal wall. This is the most important concept, okay, that how it is passing through the abdominal wall. So as it pushes through the abdominal wall, it actually pierces the different layers. Now every layer sticks to it. So later these becomes the coverings of the spermatic cord. As you can see, all the structures through which it passes, all the structures, all the muscles, the aponeurosis of the muscles actually give off some coverings around the spermatic cord. If you have taken other lectures, you should have already know that the coverings of the spermatic cord are actually external spermatic fascia, internal spermatic fascia. So actually from where are they coming from? They are actually coming from the layers that were surrounding and from which this structure was passing through actually. Now imagine pushing your finger through 3 blankets. Now each blanket wraps around your finger. It is just like that. You push a finger through the blanket. So what happens? Each blanket wraps around your finger. Exactly the same thing happens with the testes or the spermatic cord. The structures through which it passes, they actually form the coverings or gives off some coverings, and that surrounds the spermatic cord. Now let's study about the coverings of the spermatic cord from the inside to the outside. Now first layer is actually the deep, first layer from which it is going to pass, it is the deep inguinal ring. Now here it passes through what? The deep inguinal ring is actually a hole in the transversalis fascia. So that means the first layer is going to pierce the structure that is going to pierce is the transversalis fascia. Now it carries this fascia with it, and this fascia becomes the internal spermatic fascia. Now remember, the transversalis fascia is actually giving rise to the internal spermatic fascia, and this is actually the first covering. Now the layer 2, the layer 2 now now for the layer 2 it is entering the internal oblique muscle. That means the layer 2 is the internal oblique muscles. So according to our book says that it takes some of its lowest fibers of the internal oblique muscles. Now why only lowest fibers of the internal oblique? Why the book is specifically mentioning that word? Because only lower fibers lie in its path. These fibers become cremaster muscle and the fascia around them actually becomes the cremasteric fascia. So therefore the internal oblique gives two things. First, it gives the cremasteric muscle, and second is it gives the cremasteric fascia. Now the function of the cremaster, if we learn or know about the function of the cremaster, so the function of the cremaster is that later in life it raises the testes. It raises the testis like in cold weather, cremaster contracts when there is a downfall of temperature or the temperature falls below. Then the cremasteric muscle contract, and this pulls the testes upwards. So it actually raises the testes, the cremaster muscle. Now the next layer it is going to pierce is the transversus abdominis muscle. If you have learned the layers of the abdominal wall, that is the first lecture in my playlist of the abdomen. In that lecture we have studied about the layers of the abdominal wall. If you have taken the lecture about the layers of the abdominal wall, you will easily understand what I am saying and how these layers are actually arranged. So next comes the transversus abdominis muscle. Now it passes under the arching and fibers of the transversus abdominis muscle and therefore does not acquire a covering. Okay, the transversus abdominis muscle, if you have taken the previous lecture, in that lecture I was actually telling about the arching fibers of the transversus abdominis muscle. So actually the transversus abdominis muscles, they do not come in contact with this testes or spermatic cord. They actually arch over the spermatic cords. So that's why spermatic cord is not taking any covering from the transversus abdominis muscles. So remember, the lower fibers of the transversus abdominis muscle arch over the inguinal canal, and that's why the processus that is actually the processus vaginalis, it passes below the muscle instead of through it. So therefore it does not receive any covering, and this is why transversus abdominis contributes nothing to the spermatic cord coverings, and this is actually very commonly asked question. Now the next layer it is going to pierce, it is finally the external oblique aponeurosis, that is the most superficial layer, the superficial muscular layer in the abdominal cavity. Now it actually pushes through the external oblique aponeurosis. So this forms the superficial inguinal ring, that is the hole in the external external oblique muscle. And this superficial inguinal ring, then from its margins it is going to take covering from the internal oblique aponeurosis, and this covering is called the external spermatic fascia, that is actually the most present on the most outside of the you can say the inguinal canal. Now the final coverings, if we summarize all the coverings of the spermatic cord, they are actually in this that form. That first is the transversalis fascia, it is forming the internal spermatic fascia. Then the other layer is the internal oblique layer, that are actually the original layers, internal oblique, and then that internal oblique is going to find the covering, that is the cremaster muscle and the cremasteric fascia. Then the transversus abdominis muscle, it is not giving any covering, and then the external oblique aponeurosis, that is giving rise to the external spermatic fascia. Now we can answer the question that why is the processus vaginalis formed. So the reason is, as the processus vaginalis tunnels through the abdominal wall, it creates a passage, and that passage is then called the inguinal canal. So that means if there is no processus vaginalis, that means there will be no inguinal canal. Now the next topic subtopic is about the gubernaculum. Now comes to the second important structure. So according to our book, it says a band of mesenchyme. So what is actually a mesenchyme? A mesenchyme is embryonic connective tissue. Now you have to imagine a fibrous cord, okay? The testes, then fibrous cord, and then that is going to form the future scrotum. That cord is called the gubernaculum, okay? That fibrous cord is called the gubernaculum. Now the function of this is, it guides for the gonadal descent. That means the structure which is guiding for the descent of the testes is the gubernaculum, and it acts like a rope actually. So the gonad follows it, and then it reaches the scrotum or its future place. Okay. Now let's study specifically about the male descent. So according to our book, the testes descend through pelvis and inguinal canal during months 7 and 8 of the fetal life. Now what is the timeline? Month 3 there will be high, they are in the high abdominal part. Now in month 7 they are entering the inguinal canal, and in month 8 they are actually reaching the inside the scrotum. So, and the hormone responsible for is the testosterone secreted by the fetal testes is actually responsible for the descent of the inguinal canal. Now the path of descent, if we look at the path of descent, so our book says the testes follows the gubernaculum, meaning gubernaculum acts like a GPS, you can say. You can just consider the gubernaculum as GPS. G for gubernaculum, G for GPS. That means it is guiding the guiding the gonads for their descent, and then the testes follows it. Now what is its relationship with the peritoneum? So the book says that the testes descends behind the peritoneum. This means now what this actually means. It is retroperitoneal during descent. Behind the peritoneum means retroperitoneal. We are going to learn about these terms in very detail when we will study about the lecture of the peritoneum. Now first just remember, behind the peritoneum, that means the testes are first retroperitoneal, and then it does not travel inside the peritoneal cavity. That is also clearing that point, that they are not present inside the peritoneal cavity, they are actually behind the peritoneal cavity formed, and instead it slides behind the peritoneal cavity. Now it passes behind the processus vaginalis. So this sentence is very important. Now the processus vaginalis goes first, the testes follows behind it. Like first we have a tunnel first, and then we have the train later. The same example you can repeat. Now what is actually accompanying the testes? So according to our book, the ductus deferens, blood vessels, nerves, lymphatics, they all descend together. So this entire bundle is actually becoming later called the spermatic cord. Now why does the spermatic cord has its coverings? The reason we read all the coverings of the spermatic cord, because everything follows the tunnel created by the processus vaginalis. So whatever layers the tunnel collected, the spermatic cord also receives them. Hence the external spermatic fascia, cremasteric fascia, and the internal spermatic fascia are formed, and these layers are formed around the spermatic cord. Now what is the final position of actually the inguinal canal? So by the end of month 8, the testes actually reaches the scrotum. So this is actually the final position of the inguinal canal in scrotum. Now what is the fate of the processus vaginalis? So after it descends, most of it closes, only the distal end remains, and this remaining sac becomes the tunica vaginalis. Okay, the remaining sac that is left is called the tunica vaginalis, the remaining part of the processus vaginalis after some of it is obliterated. This surrounds the anterior and the lateral aspects of the testes, and it actually provides a lubricated space that allows the testes to move freely within the scrotum. Now let's move towards what happens in the females. Now for females, compare. Initially ovary also develops high in the abdomen. It also has a gubernaculum, same as like for males. So it also forms a processus vaginalis, that means. But what happens? The ovary does not descend into labium majus. Now why? Because the gubernaculum attaches to the developing uterus. So the uterus acts like a stop point, and so the descents end inside the pelvis, and they are actually not reaching the labium majus part. Okay, the ovaries are, that's why the ovaries are in the lower abdominal part, or you can say they are actually inside the pelvis. So what becomes of the gubernaculum? Now it is so actually the gubernaculum is divided by the uterus into two parts. The upper part, that is called the ligament of ovary, or you can say the ovarian ligament, and then the lower part, that will be called the round ligament of uterus. And that is actually a very important viva question, that what becomes of the gubernaculum in the female. So actually the gubernaculum is after that is divided into the two parts by the uterus. The upper part, that is called the ovarian ligament, and the lower part, that is called the round ligament of uterus. Okay. Now what passes through the female inguinal canal? Because inguinal canal is present in the female, so only the round ligament of uterus and the few lymphatic vessels are passing through the female inguinal canal, and nothing else is passing. That means the gonads are not passing through the inguinal canal of the female like that of male. Now the next thing we are going to study is about the lymphatics. So these lymphatics carry a small amount of lymph from the uterus to the superficial inguinal lymph nodes, and this is clinically important because disease from the uterine fundus can spread to these nodes via the round ligament of uterus. Okay, so that is the clinical importance of the lymphatics. Now if we understand the stages of development of the inguinal canal, so actually there are the 4 stages finally. The first is the origin. So what happens in the origin? The gonad lies high on the posterior abdominal wall. The processus vaginalis actually begin to grow downward, and the gubernaculum extend towards the labioscrotal swelling. That happens in the origin. Now what happens in the early descent? Second stage is, first is the origin, then there is going to be descent, that the gonads are then going to descend. So what happens? The processus vaginalis elongates in the descent part, and then the testes starts following the gubernaculum, because I already told you that the gubernaculum is like acting like a GPS that is guiding the testes to reach to the scrotum, and the ovary also descends slightly, but they are not actually going to reach into the through the inguinal canal. Now the third part is the further descent. So if further the descent is continuing, the testes pass through the inguinal canal, but the ovaries reaches the pelvis and stops, because the gubernaculum is attached to the uterus and the gubernaculum is not continuing further. That's why that ovaries stop there in the case of females. Now what is actually the final fate? So final fate in case of males, the testes finally reach the scrotum, that is their final position, and then the distal processus vaginalis becomes the tunica vaginalis. After its obliteration, that part that remains is called the tunica vaginalis, and then the proximal processus vaginalis normally obliterates, okay, and the gubernaculum remains as a small fibrous remnant that is anchoring the testes to the scrotum. That is showing the remains of the gubernaculum. Then about the female final fate, so ovary remains in the pelvis. I already told you, because the because the gubernaculum attaches to the posterior part of the uterus, it is not guiding further it down to the you can say through the inguinal canal. That's why the ovaries remain in the pelvis, and the upper gubernaculum becomes the ligament of ovary, and the lower gubernaculum becomes the round ligament of uterus, which passes through the inguinal canal into the labium majus. Okay, that is the lower part of the gubernaculum, and here is the upper part of the gubernaculum. So if we summarize our topic now and look let's discuss some high yield viva points that are related to our topic. So first is the processus vaginalis. So processus vaginalis is the finger like diverticulum of the peritoneum. Now the gubernaculum is actually the mesenchymal cord that is guiding the gonadal descent and is acting like a GPS. Then the third point is about the testes. So testes descends during the 7th and 8th fetal months. Remember, the 7th and 8th fetal months are important for the descent of the testes. And that if the examiner asks for the hormones responsible, then the testosterone that forms from the fetal testis is responsible for this development. And then the testes descends behind the peritoneum. You have to remember this, that the testes are not present inside the peritoneum in the fetal life. They are present in the abdominal cavity, but you cannot confuse that they are present inside the peritoneum. They are actually present behind the peritoneum. That means they are retroperitoneal. And the transversalis fascia is going to form the internal spermatic fascia. The internal oblique muscle layer is going to form the cremaster muscle and cremasteric fascia. Remember, transversus abdominis does not contribute to the covering. External oblique aponeurosis is then going to finally form the outer external spermatic fascia. And there is also a point that we discussed about the distal processus vaginalis. So the distal processus vaginalis is going to form the tunica vaginalis after its obliteration. And what happens in the female gubernaculum? So female gubernaculum is actually divided by the uterus into the ovarian ligament upper part and the round ligament of uterus lower part. And finally, what are the contents of the female inguinal canal? So the contents of the female inguinal canal are only the round ligament of uterus and a few lymphatic vessels, because I already told you that ovaries and gonads in case of females are not the part of the female inguinal canal. So that was all about the inguinal canal development. This lecture is actually the continuation of our previous lecture about the inguinal canal anatomy. So if you want to reinforce your concepts like a solid rock, first I will suggest first take the inguinal canal anatomy, then take this inguinal canal embryology. Okay, so that was all about this lecture. Thank you so much. Allah Hafiz.